The Doom of the Haunted Opera by Brad Strickland and John Bellairs. Chapter 4. On Tuesday afternoon, Jonathan Barnevelt stood at the window of his room in Lucius Mickleberry's house in St. Petersburg, Florida. He looked out on a gorgeous day. The Gulf of Mexico was calm and blue, and the white sand beach he could glimpse between the trees was blinding in the warm sunshine. He had the telephone to his ear, and he was speaking to the long-distance operator. "New Zebedee," he repeated. "The number is 865. He waited while the connection went through, and then he heard the phone ringing. After a moment, there was a click, and Mrs. Holtz said, "Hello, Barnevelt Hello, Barnevelt residence." "Hi, Hannah," said Jonathan. "How is everything?" "Oh, hello. Fine, thank you, Jonathan. Did you attend your friend's funeral?" "It was a memorial service," Jonathan said. "Yes, it was very nice. I think Lucius would have liked it." "We never know when it will be our time," said Mrs. Holtz dolefully. Jonathan grinned. For a lively little woman, Mrs. Holtz took an uncommon interest in funerals. "Say, is Louis there?" he asked. "I thought I'd speak to him if he's home from school." "Yes, just a minute." Jonathan hummed to himself. He saw Mrs. Zimmerman out on the lawn. She had changed from the black dress she had worn to the memorial service to a purple floral print, and she wore a white straw hat with a bright purple band. A balmy Gulf breeze blew, billowing her dress around her. She looked up, and Jonathan waved at her. "Hello?" It was Louis, sounding winded. "Hi," Jonathan said. "Everything all right on the home front?" There was a long pause, then Louis said, "Everything is fine. How is the weather?" "Beautiful," Jonathan said. "It's about 75 degrees and sunny. How about there?" "Cloudy, windy, and cold," Louis said. "Do you know when you'll be back?" "Not yet. We are meeting with the lawyers for the reading of the will tomorrow, and then Florence and I will have We'll have to sort out and pack books and other material. That will take some time, and we need to have the wand breaking." "The what?" asked Louis. "It's a ceremony," his uncle explained. "You see, when a wizard dies through the action of magic, his wand breaks automatically. When a wizard dies a natural death, though, as Lucius did, then his magical friends have a little farewell ceremony. They remember him and wish him well, and then snap his wand in two. If my plane crashed while I was coming back to New Zebedee—" "Gosh, Uncle Jonathan, don't even say that." Louis sounded strained and fearful. "Louis, nothing like that is going to happen. I'm just using it as an example. Then my friends would break my walking cane. Florence's would break her enchanted umbrella. It's just a ceremony, that's all." "Well, be careful anyway." Jonathan laughed. "I will. Say, is everything all right at school? Did you and Rosita find a history project?" Yes." Good, good. Well, I'll go now, Louis. Tell you what, I'll shop around down here and see if I can find you a present. The pirate Gasparilla used to operate in these waters. Maybe I can find you a real doubloon, or maybe a genuine pirate's sword." "That would be swell." "Take care, then. You too." Jonathan hung up and went downstairs to talk to Mrs. Zimmerman. She had walked far out on the lawn toward a gate that led out to the beach. As he stepped off the porch to follow her, Jonathan paused for a second. Something was troubling him. Louis could be moody at times, but he had sounded subdued and depressed. Jonathan had the feeling that Louis had never quite gotten over his parents' sudden death in a car accident several years earlier. However, Mrs. Holtz had sounded well enough, and she would have mentioned any real problems. Jonathan put his momentary worry out of his mind and trotted after Mrs. Zimmerman, yelling, "Hey, Haggie, wait up!" Back in New Zebedee, Louis hung up the phone and bit his lip. He had almost told his uncle about exploring the old theater and seeing the ghost, and about the concealed sheet music. Two concerns stopped him. First, Louis had to admit that he might be mistaken. His nerves sometimes got the better of him, and it could be that the ghost of Mr. Finster was just a figment of his overactive imagination. Still, Louis could not explain the resemblance between the man in Mr. Galway's picture album and what he thought he had seen in the orchestra pit. More important, though, was the fact that Louis did not want to spoil Jonathan's stay in Florida. He knew his uncle had a lot on his mind, and he did not want to add to his problems. When Mrs. Holtz had called him to the phone, Louis had been sitting at the dining room table, snacking on Reese's peanut butter cups and a glass of milk. He went back there now and finished the candy, thinking over what had happened at school. Miss Fogarty had liked Rosita's description of the project she and Louis had chosen, so it looked as if he would be stuck with researching the old theater. And Miss White, the music teacher, had been very interested in the old music score. She had explained that Emanuel Vanderhelm was once a world-famous tenor, and she was excited to think that this might be a long-lost work by the eminent musician. In fact, she had even telephoned the editor of the New Zebedee Chronicle with the news. Louis thought things were getting out of hand. The doorbell rang, and Louis went to answer it. It was Rosrita, her face red from the cold. "Look at this," she said, holding up a folded newspaper. Louis took it from her as she came in and closed the door. Right on the front page was a boxed story with a headline that read, "New Zebedee Youths Discover Lost Opera." It told all about Louis and Rosrita and their finding of the score to the Day of Doom in the old theater. It wound up by stating, "The opera is a parable of the modern world, showing how the new century meant the doom of the old ways, according to Miss Ophelia White. The score seems to be complete and could even be performed now." "We're famous," Rosrita said with a grin. Boy, I bet Miss Fogarty will have to give us both an A on this report." "Maybe," Louis said uncertainly. "I don't like it, though." They were standing in the hall next to the blue willow-ware vase that was crammed full of umbrellas and walking sticks. Rosrita put her hands on her hips. "Huh. You just don't like it because you got scared." "No," insisted Louis. "It isn't that. It's just, oh, I don't know. It doesn't feel right to me somehow. It's as if that stupid music had been hiding there all this time, waiting for me to come along and find it. I know that sounds dumb, but it bothers me." "Hey, relax," said Rosrita. She was about half a head taller than Louis, though he was going through what Jonathan called a growth spurt, and she looked down at him now. "You know, the music is even kind of pretty. Miss White played a few lines of the overture for me, and it doesn't sound spooky or weird." Rosrita broke off, a funny look on her face. Louis started to ask, "What isn't?" But before he could get the words out, his voice died in his throat. He heard something. It was coming from outside. It was high-pitched and wavery. It sounded like music being played on a fife, although he could not make out the tune. He shivered. "You hear that?" he whispered. Rosrita nodded, her eyes wide behind her glasses. "It's coming from the yard," she said. "You don't suppose it could be the ghost you..." Suddenly Louis relaxed and laughed. He had recognized the tune. It was "Good Night, Ladies," and every second note was horribly flat. He went to the door, paused with his hand on the knob, and said, "Rosrita, meet the Phantom of the New Zebedee Opera," then threw the door wide. A black and white striped cat came strolling in from the cold. He looked up at Rosrita, meowed, and sat down to wash himself. "I don't get it," said Rosrita. "Didn't I tell you about Jailbird?" asked Louis. "Gee, I thought I had. Last spring, Uncle Jonathan and I were out in the yard, and when this cat showed up. We later found out he belongs to Miss Gear, the librarian, but we didn't know it then. Uncle Jonathan cast a magic spell on him just for fun, and the cat started to whistle." Rosrita gave him a hard stare. "You're kidding." "No," said Louis. "It's the truth." As if to demonstrate, Jailbird suddenly puckered his little cat lips and began to whistle, "I'll Take You Home Again, Kathleen." Rosrita winced. "He's awful," she said. Louis shrugged. "Well, cats don't have much in the sense of pitch, Uncle Jonathan says. Anyhow, Jailbird seemed to like his new talent so much that Uncle Jonathan said he wouldn't take the spell off unless he started to do bird calls. Last summer, when you were gone to Pennsylvania and Uncle Jonathan and I were off in Europe, Miss Gear took him to the radio studio talent contest. But they disqualified him because they said nobody at home would believe it was really a cat whistling. And anyway, he wasn't very good." The cat began a terrible off-key rendition of "On Top of Old Smoky." "Can't you make him stop?" asked Rosrita with a grimace. "Sure, he just wants a snack." Louis led them into the kitchen, where he opened a can of sardines. Jailbird gobbled them down and went to the heating vent, where he curled up contentedly. Louis washed the special saucer that Jonathan used for giving handouts to neighborhood pets, and the cat purred as if pleased that Louis was doing all the work. Then he softly whistled a few bars of Brahms's lullaby before going to sleep. "I guess it will wear off sooner or later," Louis said. "Most of Uncle Jonathan's spells do. You know, the fuse-box dwarf is gone. It gradually faded away, and then one day it just wasn't there anymore." Rosrita rolled her eyes. The fuse-box dwarf had been another of Jonathan's spells. It was an illusion of a little man who lived behind the paint cans in the cellar, and when anyone went down there, he would rush out yelling, "Dreeb, Dreeb, I am the fuse-box dwarf," and then hide again. "Your uncle doesn't do very useful magic," said Rosrita. "At least it's all harmless," returned Louis. He really didn't feel like an argument. His head ached a little, and he was still nervous about the theater and the music he had found there. But Rosrita seemed to understand. The two did their homework together, and when Rosrita went home, Jailbird left as well. Louis and Miss Holtz had dinner together, and then Louis listened to some radio shows. He went to bed about 9 o'clock, wishing that his uncle would return. That night, he tossed restlessly, unable to get to sleep for a long time. When at last he did fall asleep, he had a strange dream. He and Rosarita were walking up the stairs to the theater again, but this time the lights were on. The lights were all on, and a crowd was jostling them. The men wore black tailcoats and white ties, and they all carried top hats. The women wore long white gowns, beautiful necklaces of diamonds and pearls, and fur stoles around their shoulders. Somehow Louis and Rosarita found themselves in the auditorium, which looked rich and elegant in the warm glow of a sparkling glass chandelier. A red velvet curtain with gold fringe hid the stage, and mournful music rose from the orchestra pit. This music summoned Louis, and he plodded forward like a sleepwalker until he could look down into the pit. The light gleamed off brass horns, dark woodwinds, and satiny violins that were lying on chairs or leaning against them. The grand piano was gone, and in its place stood an imposing organ. A man sat in front of it, his long, spidery fingers flying over the keys as he played the mysterious music. Slowly his head turned. For a moment, Louis was afraid he would see the dead face of the ghost again, but this was a different person, although he was as cadaverous as the ghost he had seen. He grinned at them. "Check your heads at the hat rack counter," he called pleasantly. "We'll have no whistling cats here. This is art." Then he laughed at his own words. A cloud of black, flying things whirled out of his open mouth. At first, Louis thought they were flies, but they grew larger and larger until they were bats, and they came flapping and squeaking right at him. He and Rosarita turned and ran up the aisle, but it was full of people now who were shambling forward blindly. Louis blinked hard. They were all headless. The men's collars ended with nothing above them. The bejeweled necks of the women were cut off above the pearls and diamonds. Rosarita screamed. The music grew louder and louder behind them. "If you want a tune, you have to pay the piper," screeched the voice of the organist, and the black cloud of squeaking bats descended on Louis, driving him to the floor. He lost sight of Rosarita as he crawled frantically between the legs of the lurching, headless crowd. He had almost made it to the doorway leading to the vestibule when two balls came bouncing toward him. Only they weren't balls. They were the heads of Jonathan Barnevelt and Mrs. Zimmerman, and their faces grimaced in terror. They rolled toward Louis, their teeth snapping and clicking as if they were going to bite him. Louis scrambled back. Fingers clutched at his hair, and he heard the organist shriek, "Check this for you, sir!" Powerful hands tugged at his head. For a moment, his neck seemed to stretch like taffy, and then he heard a sharp pop as everything went black. And that's the end of chapter 4.